Hey folks, Kostya here from Las Vegas, Nevada. I just started the National Open. Actually, I'm recording this after the end of round two. Really great to be back. Haven't played over the board chess in over a year and a half. Honestly, it's crazy to be playing again. It's kind of like riding a bike, kind of like just picking up where we left off. Although I definitely felt very rusty these first two games. So I'm going to be going over my first round in this video. It was a pretty unfortunate loss for me. It was a very tough game. Well, I like to preach to my students that just because you lose a game, doesn't mean, you can lose once, but you don't have to lose twice. Obviously, it can really hurt, especially losing in the first round, especially losing when you're playing someone lower rated than you. But if you don't learn from the game, you don't take anything away from it, then it's kind of like you're losing a second time. So I do believe it's really important to go over your losses, no matter how painful they may be. And yeah, I do think the game was quite interesting and hopefully can be instructive for you guys as well. So yeah, my first round opponent was Caleb Wan, whose FIDE rating is 2013, but his USCF is above 2200. So going into it, I knew it was going to be a pretty tough game. And as you can see, we got a Taimanov Sicilian. He played e4. I went c5, knight f3, e6, d4 takes, knight c6, and queen c7. And here my opponent went for g3, which I actually was expecting before the game. I did a little bit of prep and I saw that he is playing this variation. And is actually kind of happy to go into this because I've actually recommended g3 myself in my own book on the Open Sicilian. And normally a lot of players don't like playing against their own lines, but I feel like, I worked so hard on these lines for white that I felt like I got a good understanding of these positions and an understanding of how to kind of make things tricky for white. So a6 here is pretty mandatory. White played bishop g2. I played d6. The point of this move order is to quickly put the bishop on d7 so that whenever white takes on c6, which they often do, I can just recapture with the bishop. So castles, bishop d7, and now white played rook e1, which is not the only way to play the position. Personally, I've always preferred to play knight to b3 and actually keep the rook on f1 so that it can support a future f4 push. But there's different ways of playing this position. White chose rook e1. I played bishop e7. This is pretty important because if black doesn't go bishop e7, white is already threatening knight d5 type ideas with the rook on e1. So bishop e7 is a very necessary move. Now white took on c6, bishop takes c6, and a4. So my theoretical knowledge of this line was actually not too deep because, well, when looking at these positions from white's point of view, I always felt like this line was actually relatively harmless. And so I never really took it so seriously from black's point of view. The idea for white is to just lock it down with a5 and try to use the b6 square, but I do think black's structure is solid enough to kind of withstand this. As you guys will see though, I had a really tough time creating counterplay in this game, and I ended up making some pretty questionable decisions in the middle game. So knight f6, a5, castles, bishop e3, knight d7, this is all normal. And now white plays knight a4, and credit to my opponent for being well prepared. This is kind of the most challenging way white can handle this variation. The idea is to drop the knight into b6, trade off the knights, and then plant the bishop on b6, which makes it difficult for black to coordinate because I can never put a rook on d8 to support my d6 pawn. So here is where I really started thinking because although I felt like I had seen this position before, I didn't quite remember the theory here, and so I tried to have a rule for myself where if I don't exactly remember the theory, then I just stop, I just pretend I don't know anything, and I just start thinking about the position on my own and just try to find good moves according to my own chess understanding. So although I had like a vague memory that black is supposed to go like rook ac8 here, rook fc8, I didn't really want to rely on my faulty memory, and I just started thinking on my own. And eventually I decided to just take this knight on a4. I think this was definitely a decision based on the fact that, I'm playing black against a lower rated player. And I want to create some imbalance. And once I trade the bishop for the knight here, what happens is white gets the two bishops, but black does have a pretty solid structure, and I guess the general strategic idea that black is playing for here is to just trade off one of the minor pieces for white's dark squared bishop. So if I can trade off bishop for bishop, that would be great, because then I feel like I get a pretty strong knight against white's bishop on g2, which is not so great. And if I trade this knight for white's dark squared bishop, then I feel like a lot of times in the opposite color bishop middle game, black's dark squared bishop is a little bit better than its counterpart. So here I decided to play rook ac8, and I felt during the game that this is, the most natural move in the world, but to my surprise, rook fc8 was actually played by Grandmaster Vitukov in a game a few years ago. Of course, he's like, 2700, super strong Russian GM, and putting the f rook on c8 here actually makes a lot of sense. I should go back for a sec. Instead of bishop takes a4, the main line is for black to play rook a e8, which is a good thing I didn't try to rely on my memory, because I don't think I would have remembered this move. And the point is that after knight to b6, black goes for this f5 break. Now this, I think, does equalize for black, but I'm kind of happy I didn't go into this anyway, because in case of, if white follows the main line, which is to just take on d7 and play queen to d3, after the exchanges on e4, we get this kind of position where it's hard to feel like black has a whole lot to play for. I feel like black is okay, but again, trying to play for a win, if I simplify the position too much, I think it can really make things pretty simple for the opponent. Not that he's necessarily playing just for a draw, but he can kind of play on without taking on too much risk. And I feel like when you're playing against low-rated players, you do want to at least pose some problems, give them some decisions. So I took on a4 and I go rook ac8, which is definitely an inaccuracy, because the point is after rook fc8, when white defends the c-pawn, let's say with c3 or with c4, I think c3 here is probably a little bit better, black wants to play for b5 and get this break in. And now white really needs to take en passant, otherwise black gets this like perfect c4 square for the knight, and I think stands really well. And here we can see the point of keeping the a rook on a8. Now the a6 pawn is not hanging as it usually was in the game whenever I considered this b5 push. So in this Vitukov game that I mentioned earlier, he was playing, for him, a lower rated player, Dmitry Kolars, who's like 24-56. That game continued takes, and queen e2, and although the game ended in a draw, I think it was only black who was really pushing here. And objectively, yeah, I probably should have gone for this, although I think it's a very drawish position. I don't think black has anything significant. Fischer famously said, if you're trying to play for a win with black, first you equalize and then you try to play for a win. So probably I should have gone for some position like this. But okay, I went rook ac8. White played c4. I think c3 was also totally fine. And I spent a lot of time in this position considering quite a few things. Knight e5, knight c5, bishop f6. I felt like bishop f6 was the most natural move, and if I had the game again, I would definitely want to play this one. I was expecting queen to d2, and once again, actually black should play b6 here, and this is maybe why the pawn on c4 is actually a little bit loose, because after b6 takes, white can't really grab on a6. I'm going to take on c4. He would probably have to take on b6, and then after queen takes b6, again, I think the position is equal, but let's say, in my opinion, black is slightly more equal here than white. So I would definitely prefer to be black. Do I win the game? No idea, but probably I don't end up losing it. So again, objectively, I think this was the way to go. I also considered knight e5, but my issue here was that after, let's say, white plays b3, for example, I'm not really targeting the c-pawn, and I don't really know where my knight is going after white plays a future f4. So if I put my knight on c6, then that gives up the b6 square, and I felt like I'm just going to be under this bind. So I decided to go knight c5, and of course I was really hoping that white would play bishop takes c5, but honestly I wasn't expecting this one. I think I knew my opponent was a good player, and I knew he wouldn't trade like this, because after dc, even though again we have opposite color bishops, I feel like this is actually a really nice structure, because I get the d file immediately. I have this d4 square, and yeah, this felt like a position. Objectively, I'm not sure. I think it's probably still very holdable for white, but definitely felt like this would be super pleasant for black. So I gave him a chance to go into this, but of course he just backs the rook up, and he goes rook a2, which actually surprised me. I was definitely expecting rook to a3 here, but the point of rook a2 is just to play b4 in the future, and then the rook can swing over to c2 without really hanging in any lines. All right, so here is where I make a decision that the engine absolutely hates, although this was kind of my idea when I played knight c5, and I play the move e5. And I think, this is a really interesting idea here, because objectively, it's pretty bad. It opens up the light squares, white immediately gets bishop h3, and yeah, again, according to the engine, black is basically like losing after this move, which I think is a little dramatic. Black is definitely worse. But my feeling was that this was the only way I could try to pose some difficulty for the opponent and give him some difficult decisions. And it does end up working out. My position ends up quite fine. Though again, objectively, it wasn't the right call, but I do think chess is a little bit about playing your opponent to some extent and not always about just playing the board. I also felt like if I just sit on my position, it's just very easy for white. He can just slowly advance. He has the two bishops and a space advantage, and so it could get tricky. So I felt like I had to do something. So he goes bishop h3, and in case it wasn't clear, black's idea is to put the knight on e6, maybe bring the bishop to f6, or even try to initiate a trade with bishop to g5, and then fight for the d4 square and the dark squares in the center. So white plays bishop h3. And now I do have to be careful, because if I just move the rook somewhere, let's say rook to b8, then after b4, knight e6, and queen to d5, I simply couldn't find a good move here for myself. Because if I play queen d7, then I'm all pinned up. White can go like c5 and things like this. And otherwise the knight on e6 is hanging with check. So this felt like quite a big issue. And it shows that white's bishop h3 move was actually quite natural and quite accurate, because if white had played b4 first, then I would go knight e6, and then I get a tempo on the c-pawn, and that might give me time to play bishop to g5. And if I can get bishop g5 and then trade the bishops, then I'm already starting to like black. So it was very good for white to avoid this. Now he does offer me a somewhat tempting exchange sacrifice. I definitely considered knight takes e4 here, especially because I felt like after bishop takes c8 and rook takes c8, I got a very healthy pawn, and the c4 pawn is hanging, and white doesn't have b3 because I have knight c3. But the problem is it just didn't work for me concretely. White can go bishop to b6 here, and if I take on c4, I actually didn't check this one with the engine, but I'm sure white has a number of ways. But during the game, I found this move rook a4, which I just couldn't figure out for myself, and it looked like I'm losing the knight on e4. I could, I think, play queen c6, but I didn't really believe in it after a move like, I'm not sure if I think maybe queen f3 was the problem. And then if queen takes c4, if I'm not mistaken, white can maybe play b3. And yeah, it seemed like I was just losing material here. So I was very, very skeptical of this. Maybe I missed something, but the engine does confirm that black indeed cannot take on e4. So I play knight e6. White plays b3. And now I thought I came up with a clever move, rook c e8. And the point of this one is that it's kind of prophylactic, so I was expecting queen d5 here from white, for example, and then I can meet this with bishop to g5, and now my knight on e6 is defended, so if bishop takes e6, I have fe, the tempo on the queen, and in general I felt like any kind of structure, for example, even if white just took in this position, I really felt like this structure would be very, very playable for black, because I cover the d5 square, I get an open f-file, so maybe I can create some counterplay. And although my bishop looks passive, it is defending the d6 pawn, and it's not super obvious how white can put a ton of pressure on this one. So I felt like this kind of knight orf structure was very playable for me, but I wasn't sure if white would go into it or not. He goes bishop to b6. I played queen c6, and here he actually does surprise me with the move bishop takes e6, which I felt like was an absolute gift. During the game, I was mainly expecting queen to d5, and I still hadn't made up my mind about what I was going to do here, because this does pose some difficulties for black. If I take on d5, I was kind of expecting c takes d5, and I had calculated a line here, knight to g5, hitting the bishop, and knight f3 check, bishop g2. And now white is threatening h4, because my knight is trapped. So I felt like my only move now is going to be f5 to try to take on e4. And I felt like white just goes rook to c2 here. And with the idea of trying to come into c7. And if I take a bunch of times on e4, I wasn't totally sure what's going on here during the game, but yeah, it was really kind of unclear to me. If I go rook to c8, then white has rook c4, and he takes over the c-file. So I was mainly considering like rook f3 here, and yeah, it just felt like kind of a mess. White goes rook c7, rook takes b3, rook takes b7, and yeah, honestly, I didn't feel super comfortable with this one because white is getting rook a7 and can just take this pawn. My bishop is still passive. But if I had nothing better, then maybe I would have to go here and just hope for the best. I'm sure white can do better. After the game, actually, the engine points out that instead of c takes d5, it's a lot stronger to go e takes d5, which I kind of also considered, but it felt a little bit less critical, because after knight g5, let's say bishop to g2, it kind of feels like, okay, I get f5, I get my pawns moving, and this is just obvious counterplay, which shows the difference between a human point of view and an engine point of view, because Stockfish takes one look at this position and just spits out c5 and says, white is completely winning, +3, +3.5. And the point is, if I take this pawn, white just goes d6, just giving up a second pawn. And I have to kind of take this one, and now I can go like rook d1 or rook d2, but simply the idea is to just take on b7 at some point, and I have no way of stopping bishop takes a6. Bishop can then maybe come back to b7, and this a pawn is just going to be deciding the game. So, I mean, from afar, I didn't consider anything close to this, but it shows the power of the engine, and I would say it's a pretty instructive idea, because, yeah, my first instinct here was that c takes d5 would be critical, but no, e takes d5, objectively a lot stronger. After queen d5, I mean, I don't have to take on d5, but he is threatening to take the knight on e6, and white can continue piling on the d-file, so if I don't do that, I have to come up with some other move. Bishop d8 was not working for me, because I think white can take on d8, and if I take with the rook, then the knight on e6 hangs. If I take with the knight, I get the dream combo, but the problem is white can just come in, like queen takes, pawn takes, and bishop c8, and yeah, I lose the a pawn, and it looks like a very difficult position. Seeing this position now, I'm realizing maybe I could try knight e6 here, with the idea of bishop takes a6, knight c5. The bishop is trapped, but white has bishop d7, unfortunately, and is going to win the c6 pawn. Although rook b8 here, yeah, honestly, I'm not really sure about this one, but well, let's say after bishop d8, yeah, I'm sure white has a number of ways of just keeping a big advantage, because black is just very, very passive here. So I would have had to figure something out. As it happens, he took on e6, and here, I felt like my previous play was now just completely justified, because I got the structure I was kind of looking for, and I started actually feeling very confident. Although, to be fair, the engine still thinks white is clearly better. During the game, though, I felt like things were definitely trending my way. And as we'll see, the trend definitely continues in my favor. Although, unfortunately, in the time scramble, things kind of don't really play out for me. So rook d2, rook f6, and now I'm just starting my attack on the king side. And here white plays rook to d3. The engine points out that c5 was actually quite strong, with the idea of d takes c5, rook to d7. During the game, I didn't quite see the point of this one, but actually the idea is just to go rook c7 next, and again take on b7. And optically, it doesn't feel like huge for white. It feels like, okay, black can get some counterplay. The bishop is now blocked off. I can maybe hit the f2 pawn at some point, but the engine doesn't care. The engine just calculates way out in advance, and it just sees that this is good for white. But to a pair of, lowly masters, definitely not so obvious. So rook d3, rook f8, White played rook e2. And here I played queen e8. I was also considering starting with h5, but I think things would likely transpose. If white plays h4 here, I don't really have anything better than to try to transfer my queen over with queen to e8. So I started with this one. White played rook to c2, which makes a lot of sense. He wants to play for the c5 break. And now I played h5. And honestly, I felt really good about this position. In fact, I had flashbacks of this recent game that Magnus played. Very, very nice victory against Wesley. So I'll quickly just show you guys the position because I loaded the game up. It didn't come from a Sicilian. It actually came from e4, e5, Joko Piano. But yeah, basically Magnus had, let's see, this position here. And he comes up with an absolutely brilliant attack. After queen to b4, he goes knight f5, queen c5. Looks like white is about to take the c6 pawn. He doesn't care. He just goes rook f7. And his point is that after queen takes c6, he has the fantastic shot knight to e3. With the idea f takes e3, simple queen takes e3 check. White's rook on f1 is very loose. After king g2, queen e2 check. Black is winning the rook and will be up at the exchange, but also white's king is kind of just getting mated here very soon. So that was kind of a nice idea. After rook ae1, he just plays h5. And amazingly, white just had no defense to the threat of h4 and h3. Wesley tried h3 here. He could have also tried h4, but after h4, black just like breaks through with knight takes h4 and g takes h4, queen g4 check, bishop g3. Now very important to see this in advance, which of course Magnus did. Rook takes f2. Just a fantastic shot. Actually easy to miss this one. A lot of players might think, okay, bishop is on g3, everything is solid, but no, rook takes f2, takes, queen takes g3, and both of white's rooks are hanging, and white's king is in big trouble. So really nice detail there. Wesley played h3. And the game just had like absolutely beautiful finish. h4. Magnus's point here was that if g4, in addition to just taking on h3, I think his idea was actually to play this fantastic shot knight g3. With the point that if f takes g3, black takes on f1, and it's simply mate with the two rooks. So really, really beautiful mating idea. As it happens, Wesley took on c6. Knight takes g3 was played anyway, and yeah, the game was over, and white's position soon just totally collapsed. So in the back of my mind during this game, especially once I had played h5, I definitely had flashbacks of this Magnus game, feeling like, okay, I have some similar attacking ideas, but there are some very clear differences between this position and the other one. Number one, I'm not Magnus, in case that wasn't obvious, but more importantly, I don't have a knight. Knights are often very, very good attackers, and compared to the Magnus game, my queen actually never enters the attack. And I can say that now that I've seen the game and analyzed it for quite some time. But during the game, it actually wasn't obvious to me that this attack is not going to work out if the queen doesn't get in. So white played h4 here, and now I played rook to g6. So I'm threatening to take on h4. And I have a tactical point if queen takes h5. Then my idea is to go rook takes g3 and winning the queen. Yeah, it was definitely feeling very good here. Objectively, the engine thinks queen g6 is better. And no surprise here, I'm getting the queen in. And I have ideas like rook f4, for example. Oops, not rook f3, rook f4. Just hitting everything. Objectively, it's supposed to be a draw after c5. Black can either take on c5 or push d5, and there's a lot of complications here, but the main thing that the engine sees is that after something like rook d7, if I want to bail out, I always have this move rook takes f2, queen takes g3, where basically black has a perpetual. Not more than a perpetual, but perpetual and good enough for a draw. I have no idea what my opponent would have played after queen g6, but he can go c5 here, bishop c7 I think is another option, although on this one after rook f4, let's say takes here, I think the position is still kind of drawish. For example, white can go rook d8 and trade off a pair of rooks and get some counterplay, and yeah, I don't have such a clear path to checkmate on the king side. That said, that was still kind of the best way to go, but I played rook g6, which does end up working out. Now white goes bishop to c7. And here again, I have like a big choice. I could play queen c6 and pretty much keep it safe. The point being, after white takes on d6, I can trade, take on e4. Material is basically even, but I felt like after rook d8, I really didn't see that I could have any chances here of actually playing for the win. I do have some counterplay against white's king, but so does white. My king is also somewhat exposed here. My pawns are definitely very weak. So I felt like white is probably going to have enough for a draw in pretty much most cases. So I really took some time here. At this point, it's move 27. We're approaching time trouble. And I definitely understood, I was going to be taking some risk here. And I mean, this was really a moment where I felt the rust, from the pandemic. I really felt it because, I was calculating a lot of lines here, and things were getting pretty sharp, and there were many lines that weren't working out for me. And yeah, I could actually just definitely feel myself getting nervous with the impending time trouble. I think at this point we both had something like maybe 20 minutes left or so. So really not a lot of time to make 13 more moves for the time control. The official time control, I should have mentioned, was game in 90, so 40 moves for 90 minutes. And then once you make 40 moves, you get an additional 30 minutes with a 30-second increment. And you don't want to leave yourself with like just a few minutes, right? Once it gets to move 30, move 35, because this is typically one of the most complicated parts of the game, and if you don't have a lot of time, it's very easy for things to go wrong, as they do happen here. So after some time, I eventually decided on rook f4, hitting both the e4 and the h4 pawns. And yeah, here white actually really surprised me with this move king f1. I completely overlooked it. I think I was mainly expecting bishop takes d6, and then my idea was to take on h4, and now after bishop takes e5, I believe I wanted rook takes e4. And yeah, I'm not sure what's happening in this position. I think it's a total mess, but I felt like I had decent chances here, and yeah, I felt like things could kind of work out for me. h5 pawn is still poisoned, bishop is under attack, and thankfully this bishop on h4, of course, is threatening, or is defending the d8 square, which is an important point to remember, because I really wanted to play like bishop f6 in this position and try to keep everything solid, but the problem is white just takes on e5 anyway, and I can't take back because d8 is hanging. I also considered maybe white would play king to h2 here, in which case I think I would take on e4, and after bishop takes d6, here I think I could play a move like bishop f6. I definitely considered stuff like bishop takes h4 in almost every position, but a lot of times I just simply couldn't make it work because white's rook on d3 very well placed to cover the king. And yeah, I couldn't really find anything convincing here for black for the piece. Okay, in any case, white plays king f1. And now I think I found the best move, rook fg4, threatening to take on h4 because of rook g1 check coming. So bishop takes d6, bishop takes h4, bishop takes e5. And now it's important to note, I can't take on e4 because white takes on h4, and if I take white's bishop as well, white gets rook to d8, just winning the game. So my idea was to play queen to c6, and here I really started to feel confident because I felt like finally my queen is kind of getting in. I'm hitting the e4 pawn. I grab this h4 pawn, which means I have a very simple plan of just trying to like pull my bishop back and playing h4. But still the game was very tough. White played queen f3. And yeah, I spent a little bit of time here, but I didn't have a ton left, so eventually I just decided to go bishop f6. And I was mainly expecting that white would trade here. Then after rook takes f6, queen e2, I really wasn't sure what's happening here, because if I take on e4 with the rook, white can play queen takes h5. I don't really have any tactics, and white is turning rook to d8, so I think I was going to play rook h6 in this position, then white can go back queen f3, And yeah, I just didn't see anything convincing for black. I figured I have compensation for the pawn. I'm not worried about being a pawn down, but not really more than that. But as it happened, white surprised me by keeping the bishops on the board with bishop to d6. And yeah, so really interesting moment. I felt like, once again, if I take on e4, white can take on h5. Though objectively, I think maybe this is the way black can go, and I can even play rook g5 here, queen f3, and take on, well, throw in rook f5 first, as the engine wants, and then take on a5 eventually. And yeah, I think this position is more or less equal, but equal material, and the game would go on. So definitely this is maybe one of the best positions I've had all game. As it happened, I chose the move e5, which I felt was quite ambitious, but my idea is to block the bishop off and prepare h4 and simply just try to open up white's king. But unfortunately it doesn't quite work out. White played rook to d5. I played h4. G takes h4, because if white takes on e5, I'm just going to trade bishops, take on g3, and white's position looks like it's collapsing. I'm just going to take on g3 next with the rook. Instead, white just takes on h4, and I throw in rook f4, queen h3, and this is really maybe the moment I kind of regret the most about this game. I didn't have a lot of time, so I don't blame myself too much for misplaying things, but I did consider the right move, at least for a moment, which is rook g4. And the point of this one is simply to shut white's queen out from the action, not to allow the queen to come in with queen to e6 check, and yeah, basically just dominate the fourth rank with these two rooks. Now, it's a very, very interesting position. The follow-up for black is something like queen d7, which is a cute trick because it threatens rook to g1, or just queen e8 and trying to get the queen involved. And I have a feeling, had I found this one, then I likely would have won the game, or had I played this one, I likely would have won, because the position to me feels very, very difficult for white. If he takes on e5, for example, then I simply trade bishops, queen to d7, and it's resigns because I have threats of queen d1 check and rook g1, and white just doesn't have defense against everything here. I don't think he would have taken on e5. I feel like he would have done something better here, like maybe a move like f3. But it's important for black to, after f3 here, to realize that this rook on g4 is simply not hinging, and I can play a move like queen to e8. Yeah, I think I have a very reasonable position here. Now, white can trade the queen for two rooks, and we can get something like this. And honestly, objectively, I think white should be totally fine here. So I'm not sure if we would have gotten this in the game or not, and who knows what would have happened. Objectively, white should be okay, but this was kind of the only way I could create some real winning chances for myself. Because white's king is very open, the queen is very active, and so yeah, white doesn't really have a ton of counterplay just yet. Has to kind of defend the king. As it happens, after queen h3. I decided to play rook takes h4, and my reasoning was that after queen e6 check, king h7, I just felt like white's queen can't really do anything. e5 pawn is still poisoned, and after a move like queen f5, for example, my idea was to just kick the queen out with rook to f4, and then queen h3 check, for example, rook h6. Felt like my king is very, very safe in this position, and yeah, my initiative kind of continues against white's king. So that was my idea. That's why I kind of went for this line. But white found a very strong move here, rook to c3, which I completely overlooked. I just didn't even consider it. And the point is to bring this rook over to h3 and trade off one of my rooks. Very logical once you see it. And it was in this position that I started to realize the problem with my position, and that is that my queen has just been completely sidelined by this construction of rook on d5, bishop on d6. All of white's pieces are perfectly defended. I have no entryway on the queen side, and no way to get in on the king side too. White's queen is also kind of dominating me. In fact, I'm a little bit lucky that my queen isn't simply trapped, as rook c5 would be winning if not for queen takes e4. And so after rook c3, I basically burned all my time here just looking for a move. And I think the issue here from my point of view, was that, I'm still looking for an advantage, right? I've been attacking, the game has just gone in black's favor for many moves, and so I'm still in the mindset of like, I need to look for a variation that leads to black's advantage. So I'm sure I considered the only move in this position, but I discarded it because I felt like it made things very, very easy for white. I think my first thought was bishop to g5, but then after queen f5, I wasn't sure what to do. Despite this, I ended up going for this anyway because I simply didn't have a lot of time. As it turns out, the only move for black to survive the position was rook takes e4. Now here's the thing though, I didn't know that I was in a case where I have to find a survival move, right? I'm still in the mindset of like, I'm the higher rated player, we're in a time scramble, it feels like white has the weaker king, like I should be looking for stuff. I discarded this one because I felt like it just makes things too easy for white. It goes rook h3 check, and well actually here I would have to find bishop h4 to equalize. I think in the game I was more thinking along the lines of rook h4, but actually after takes queen f5, white is just much better. I mean, this rook on g6 is pinned, and it's very hard to unpin. King h6 is a very loose move to make, and at some point white's just going to take this e5 pawn, and yeah, white is the one with the way more active pieces, and my queen on c6, again, just totally shut out from the game. So I'm not sure if I would have found bishop h4. I mean, from a human point of view, it's difficult to make a move, right, when you pin your own piece. I'd expect like queen f5 at some point, but I think the idea is for black to play rook f4, and basically black can hold this one, but yeah, from afar, I really just didn't take this one too seriously. It just felt too awkward. So I played bishop g5, queen f5, and now I think at this point actually I have like maybe 2 or 3 minutes left, and yeah, I was really expecting to find the move here. One thing I should point out is that if queen takes e5, I have this trick with bishop f4, and I think white is actually just losing the bishop on d6, oddly enough. Just the queen doesn't have any good moves. Queen f5 I'm just taking here, but yeah, of course white plays queen f5, which is much stronger, keeping my rook and king kind of tied up. And yeah, I had really hard time finding a move here, because if I go rook f4, well then now white can play queen takes e5, and I just didn't understand, like, what am I doing here? It's like, now I'm just losing this pawn, and 2 pawns down, and yeah, still no real attack from black's point of view. So I did one of those things where you look at all the moves, and you end up playing a move that you didn't really consider. Pretty much anything was better than what I ended up doing, but nothing looked good, so I ended up just making semi-random move bishop h6, just thinking like, okay, I'll cover the h file, and now rook h3 doesn't come with a check in any variation. I just felt like, okay, let me just make this move and put the move on white and see what he does. But it turns out actually just to make the task really, really simple, as white just has rook to g3, and black is just busted. I have no defense to this threat. Very simple threat on my rook to g6. Now it looks like just such a simple blunder, but this often happens when you have a tough position. As I later found out, black is already lost here, so I don't actually have any good moves, but I'm sure I could have a move to at least put up much better resistance. Like for instance, rook f4, the game is certainly not over, and I could still fight. So I end up playing a move that kind of looks semi-solid, but ends up being actually much worse than anything else I considered, which is a fortunate situation. But yeah, that's what happened. Bishop h6, and now rook to g3. I have no way of defending the rook except for queen to e8, and yeah, simply rook takes e5 just ended the game, as my queen is short on squares, the rook on g6 is hanging. I think the only move I could really consider here is rook f4, but I'm pretty sure white has a number of ways to get a winning advantage. The simplest one probably just taking on e8. I could take on f5 here, ef5, and escape into an endgame where I'm down an exchange in 2 pawns. But I really felt like my saving chances here were pretty much zero, and so I didn't even try, and I ended up just resigning after rook takes e5. I figured, okay, game is over. Just yeah, no defense. Rook f4, completely unsatisfactory, and yeah, might as well just call it a day and rest up for the next round. So Yeah, really tough start. I mean, of course, I hope to win this game. And although my move e5, in the middle game, we could say is extremely controversial as it gives white a big advantage, I did feel like I actually had reasonable chances in this game. And yeah, had I found this move rook gg4, who knows what could have happened from here. But full credit to my opponent. I mean, he definitely didn't play perfectly. He made some of his own mistakes, but he certainly outplayed me in the time scramble, and I feel like he understood the position better than me in terms of the importance of having an active queen in such a sharp situation. And like I said, I simply realized too late that my queen on c6 here ended up dominated as it happened in the game with rook takes h4 and queen e6, and yeah, again, really nice move, rook c3. So yeah, unfortunate loss, but it was instructive, especially if you're a Taimanov Sicilian player. This is a structure that is not always so dangerous for black, but there are many ways to misplay it, as you guys can see. I ended up winning my next round, round 2, which was a very, very sharp game. So I hope you guys look forward to seeing my thoughts on that one. And yeah, I guess I'll see you guys in future videos. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, I guess make sure to do so. Also, make sure to subscribe to ChessDojo's YouTube channel. I'll leave a link in the description below. If you haven't heard, I've been doing most of my videos for ChessDojo these days, so you can find a lot more of my content on there. Alright guys, I am going to try and rest up for the next round, and hopefully I'll see you in the future. Take care.